One elegant afternoon. One cup of tea. One murder no one expected. Welcome to Unsolved Mystery Vault. I'm your moderator Falcon. Share your thoughts. Where are you tuning in from today? Your feedback makes this journey unforgettable. Let's step into the story. Chapter 1, The Garden Tea at Fernwood House. On an unusually warm June afternoon, the village of Little Bristow shimmered with a gentle golden haze, as though the sun itself had decided to linger over its quiet lanes and ivy-touched cottages. It was the sort of day that inspired contented sighs, leisurely strolls, and, most importantly, a perfectly arranged garden tea, an event for which Mrs. Eleanor Forsyth prided herself with near-military precision. Fernwood House stood on a modest rise overlooking the green, its manicured garden pathways curving like ribbons between cream-colored rose bushes and tall foxgloves. The villagers often remarked that Mrs. Forsyth's garden always looked prepared for royalty, though it was more often prepared for gossip, which Mrs. Forsyth encouraged just as eagerly. By 3:30, the tea tables were set beneath a pergola laced with wisteria. Silver teapots gleamed, cucumber sandwiches lay in crisp triangles, and delicate pastries, imported from a new bakery in nearby Stretton, waited on tiered stands. A phonograph played a lilting waltz somewhere under the lilac tree, its music just loud enough to add a sense of occasion, and just soft enough not to interfere with conversation. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a pale lavender suit and wearing a straw hat decorated with a modest ribbon, arrived precisely on time. She was greeted warmly by Mrs. Forsyth, who always insisted Miss Marple lent an air of respectability to any gathering. Standing amidst a cluster of chattering matrons and local worthies, Miss Marple observed the scene with her usual gentle curiosity. She had been to dozens of garden teas in her lifetime, and though outwardly identical, china cups, polite laughter, tidily trimmed hedges, they were each, in their own way, a world full of tiny dramas. A raised eyebrow here, a forced smile there, a pair of neighbors studiously avoiding each other's eyes. Human nature, Miss Marple always said, had a way of repeating itself with all the consistency of perennials. It did not take her long to notice, for instance, that Mrs. Forsyth's niece, young Clara Burrows, looked rather strained as she stood near the refreshment table, her hands clasped too tightly around the handle of a teapot. Clara was normally quite cheerful, a girl of 26 with bright brown eyes and an air of eager helpfulness, but today, she seemed uncharacteristically tense. Not far from her stood Mr. Lionel Hargreaves, the well-known antiques dealer whose shop in the village boasted treasures from half of English history. He spoke animatedly to Reverend Caddington, but his gaze kept sliding toward Clara with a curious mixture of irritation and apprehension. Miss Marple took an innocent sip of her tea. She had seen such looks before. Across the lawn, Colonel Archer, retired but not from boasting, was holding court as he relayed, for the 5th or possibly 6th time, an exaggerated version of his days in India. His wife, Mrs. Beatrice Archer, sat beside him with a thin, weary smile that suggested she had heard the story countless times more than that. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lydia Hargreaves, Lionel's second wife and a woman of striking composure, mingled gracefully among the guests, her calm smile betraying not the slightest hint of the tension that seemed to follow her husband and Clara like a faint shadow. "Quite a turnout," remarked Dr. Alfred Penrose, appearing at Miss Marple's side. "Mrs. Forsyth has outdone herself, though I dare say her pastries are a trifle too sweet." Miss Marple gave a soft laugh. "I imagine sweetness does little harm compared to some of the sharper flavors one finds in conversation." "Ah, Dr. Penrose chuckled. "Indeed." They stood together a moment, surveying the gathering. It was a peaceful, pleasant scene in every respect, almost too pleasant. In Miss Marple's experience, such scenes had a curious way of turning into something altogether different when one least expected it. And she was not the only one to sense a current beneath the calm surface of the afternoon. For just as Colonel Archer reached the crescendo of his tale, the famous moment he supposedly convinced a wild elephant to retreat through sheer force of authority, a sudden cry broke through the air. A young maid hurried from the direction of the house, her face pale and her apron stained with spilled tea. "Mrs. Forsyth! Mrs. Forsyth," she called, her voice trembling. The conversations halted. Every head turned. Mrs. Forsyth, alarmed, set down her teacup. "What is it, Margaret?" The maid swallowed. "It's Mr. Hargreaves, ma'am. He's collapsed in the library." A gasp rippled through the garden, like wind over tall grass. "Collapsed?" Mrs. Lydia Hargreaves repeated sharply, her poise cracking for the first time. "What do you mean collapsed?" I think he's dead, ma'am." "Dead?" It was a word that seemed entirely out of place amidst the roses and scones, yet it struck with unmistakable weight. Several guests gasped, others reached for their chairs, and Mrs. Forsyth herself teetered as though she might faint. Miss Marple remained quite still. Her expression was calm, saddened, yes, but not surprised. She had lived too long, observed too much, to believe that peaceful occasions were safe from the darker sides of human nature. "Someone fetch the doctor," cried Mrs. Archer. "I am here, dear," Penrose said grimly, already moving toward the house. "Miss Marple, would you?" But she was already walking beside him, her gentle footsteps quiet on the garden path. Inside Fernwood House, the air felt distinctly cooler, as though the cheerful warmth of the garden could not reach the polished halls. The maid led them into the library, a handsome room lined with books, with a large mahogany desk near the window. There, crumpled beside the armchair, lay Lionel Hargreaves. His face was unnaturally still. His right hand clutched the fabric of his jacket, and on the floor beside him sat a cup of now-cooled tea, its contents spilled like a pale halo. Penrose knelt quickly and examined the body. Miss Marple watched quietly, her eyes not on the body but on the room around it, the overturned cup, the faint indentation in the rug near the desk, the half-drawn curtains, the open book on the table. Finally, the doctor exhaled heavily and stood. "He is dead," he confirmed. "Though not, I think, from natural causes." Behind them, Mrs. Lydia Hargreaves let out a strangled cry. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the tea-cup on the floor. Her expression was unreadable. Outside, the music had stopped. The garden, minutes ago alive with polite chatter, was now silent as a grave. And thus began the mystery that would grip Little Bristow, a mystery born not of shadows or storms, but in the bright, tranquil heart of a summer tea party. Chapter 2, The village reacts. The shock of Lionel Hargreaves's death settled over Fernwood House like a creeping fog, thickening with every passing minute as guests clustered anxiously in the drawing-room. Mrs. Forsyth, flustered and wringing her lace handkerchief, insisted on gathering everyone indoors, for safety, though no one could have said precisely what danger threatened them. The hush among the guests was punctuated only by whispered theories and sharp intakes of breath whenever the door creaked. Miss Marple, having remained in the library a moment longer after Dr. Penrose's examination, joined the others with a thoughtful expression as she took a discreet seat near the mantelpiece. She did not insert herself into the frantic conversation, she simply listened, her pale blue eyes moving softly from one face to another as threads of gossip began to weave themselves into dangerous speculation. Reverend Caddington stood near the piano, smoothing down his waistcoat. "A terrible tragedy, terrible indeed," he murmured to Colonel Archer, who had taken the opportunity to recount his familiarity with death in far more physically dramatic circumstances. Mrs. Archer remained silent beside him, her gaze fixed on the carpet as though she feared to meet another human eye. "It must have been his heart, Mrs. Forsyth insisted for the third or fourth time, each repetition sounding more like a plea than a statement. Lionel always did indulge too much in rich food. And the heat, surely the heat could have affected him. Dar. Penrose turned to her gently. It was not heat, nor heart failure, I'm afraid. I will need to notify Inspector Grange, but his symptoms, yes, I feel certain it was something introduced into his system very recently. A gasp swept through the room. Mrs. Forsyth sank into a chair. Mrs. Archer pressed a hand to her throat. Clara Burrows, standing alone near the sideboard, went pale enough that Miss Marple quietly rose and guided her to sit before she fainted. Poison, no one dared speak the word, but its presence settled heavily among them, as unmistakable as a draught in a sealed room. Mrs. Lydia Hargreaves, who had been standing rigidly near the window, finally turned toward Dr. Penrose, her composure visibly fractured. You are suggesting, she said, each word edged with ice, that my husband was murdered in Mrs. Forsyth's house. No, Mrs. Hargreaves, Dr. Penrose replied evenly, I am suggesting that something he consumed today was responsible. The inspector will need to determine the rest. All eyes turned toward the long table still laden with the remnants of the tea. So innocent a spread, yet now regarded as though each pastry might conceal danger. Miss Marple stepped toward the garden doors and paused, surveying the tables where Lionel Hargreaves had earlier stood laughing. The cup near the edge of the table, a twin to the one found in the library, caught her attention. A few droplets of tea spotted the cloth below it, the tiniest scatter of evidence in plain sight. Behind her, the guests murmured with rising unease. Reverend Caddington said solemnly, surely no one here, among us, would do such a thing. Lionel may have had his imperfections, but murder? In Little Bristow? Well, Colonel Archer interjected, one never knows what people are capable of. That man had a temper, I'll say that. A temper? Mrs. Forsyth whispered faintly. Lionel? He always struck me as so charming. Charming enough, Mrs. Archer muttered in a tone brittle with long-held truth. But not always kind. Miss Marple returned quietly, slipping into a seat as though merely resting her legs. She had no need to raise her voice, people's thoughts were loud enough without her prompting. And indeed, Dr. Penrose sought her out with a low murmur. Miss Marple, you saw the room. Do you believe someone intended this? She replied softly, I believe, doctor, that people rarely die in libraries during tea parties without someone intending something. Before more could be said, Inspector Grange entered the drawing room. His heavy footstep and square shoulders brought instant silence. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. He removed his hat with a sober nod. Dr. Penrose has informed me of the situation. For now, no one is to leave Fernwood House. Mrs. Forsyth nearly dropped her handkerchief. But Inspector, we must proceed properly, Grange said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned first to Lydia Hargreaves. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. If you're able, I'd like a few words in private. She inclined her head stiffly and followed him. While they stepped into a side room, Clara Burrows watched them with wide, trembling eyes. Miss Marple noticed. She noticed, too, that Clara's glance flicked not toward Lydia or the inspector, but toward the library door. Suspicion pressed into the room from all sides. People who had earlier chatted pleasantly over lemon tarts now observed one another as though each face might hide an unreadable mask. Mrs. Archer whispered to her husband, I'm sure Lionel argued with someone last week outside the post office. Nonsense, my dear, Colonel Archer scoffed, though uneasily. He argued with everyone. Reverend Caddington added, poor Lydia. This will devastate her. Dr. Penrose lowered his voice. She seemed more shocked than devastated. Miss Marple caught that remark, the way one might tuck away a useful pin. Then Clara, barely audible, murmured to her, I didn't think it would go this far. Miss Marple tilted her head. My dear, what do you mean? Clara froze. Her lips trembled before she pulled them tightly together. Nothing. I meant nothing. I shouldn't have said anything. Before Miss Marple could gently coax further truth, Inspector Grange returned with his notebook. I'll need statements from each of you, he announced. One at a time. He called the first name. The guests shifted nervously. Miss Marple rose when summoned, smoothing her skirt as she prepared to follow the inspector. But she cast one last look at Clara Burrows. Clara's eyes darted away immediately. And in that small, human gesture, fear mixed with guilt, mixed with something else entirely, Miss Marple felt the first true spark of understanding. Chapter 3, Early Investigation. Inspector Grange led Miss Marple into Mrs. Forsyth's small morning room, a cozy space with floral wallpaper and a view of the rose garden. The soft clink of distant teacups, nervous guests trying to busy themselves, drifted faintly through the house. Miss Marple settled into a cushioned chair with the serene composure of someone who had seen more than most suspected. Grange, notebook in hand, cleared his throat. Miss Marple, you were among the first to see the deceased. Did anything strike you as unusual? She smiled gently, adjusting her gloves. Well, Inspector, most deaths during afternoon tea are rather unusual. He exhaled, somewhere between annoyance and reluctant amusement. Besides that. Well, the cup beside Mr. Hargreaves had only a small amount spilled, which suggests he did not drop it suddenly. And the position of his body, he seemed to have moved or tried to stand before collapsing. That can indicate a sudden awareness of distress. Grange scribbled. You're suggesting poison. Miss Marple didn't nod, but her eyes softly did. I merely suggest he was taken quite by surprise. As most of us were. The inspector tapped his pen. Anything else? Her gaze drifted to the window, watching a sparrow hop across the terrace stones. People's faces, Inspector. Faces are often more revealing than fingerprints. He frowned. Whose face in particular? Several, she replied, folding her hands. But it is far too early to draw conclusions. Still, Clara Burrows seemed frightened, though not precisely with grief. And Mrs. Hargreaves's shock appeared a touch more restrained than one might expect. Meaning? Meaning nothing yet. But one must consider human nature. She paused, then added gently, grief and guilt can look strangely similar if you aren't accustomed to the distinction. Grange looked both troubled and intrigued. Well, Miss Marple, thank you. I may ask for your insights again. I shall be here, she said simply. He dismissed her, and she returned to the drawing room. As she stepped back inside, conversations halted and then resumed, like ripples smoothing over when a pebble falls into a pond. Clara looked up immediately, her face paling again at the sight of Miss Marple. Mrs. Forsyth fluttered about her guests, trying hard to maintain decorum in her trembling hands. Inspector Grange called the next name, Reverend Caddington, and the room settled into murmurous uncertainty. Miss Marple chose a seat near the hearth, knitting bag in her lap, though she did not yet take out her needles. She simply watched the guests, one by one, growing restless with waiting. It was Mrs. Archer who approached her first. She sat down beside Miss Marple with a sigh heavy enough to rustle the lace of her blouse. I cannot fathom it, Mrs. Archer whispered. Poor Lydia, and yet there was something odd about the way she looked at Lionel today. Miss Marple listened patiently. Odd, you say? Mrs. Archer nodded. More tense than usual. They were not happily matched, you know. Too much strain between them in recent months. Miss Marple did not respond, but permitted the silence to invite further truth. "I overheard them just last week, Mrs. Archer continued. In the grocer's. Something about money. A great deal of money." Lydia seemed cornered. Miss Marple tucked that away gently. "Money troubles have started many a quarrel," she murmured. Colonel Archer joined them then, leaning heavily on his cane. "If you ask me, Lionel had enemies. Business ones. That antiques shop of his was always mixed up in something or other. Strange customers coming in at odd hours." Mrs. Archer sniffed. "That's hardly a motive for poisoning him at a tea party." But Colonel Archer only shook his head with grim certainty. Before Miss Marple could inquire further, Clara Burrows abruptly rose from her seat across the room and hurried toward the hallway. Her movement was sudden, almost panicked. Miss Marple stood at once. "Excuse me," she said softly to the Archers, and followed. She found Clara halfway to the back door, her breath shaky, eyes shining with unshed tears. Miss Marple approached without haste. "My dear," she said gently, "running away rarely solves what frightens us." Clara halted, shoulders trembling. "I just needed air." "You need truth more than air," Miss Marple replied in her soft, grandmotherly way. "And the truth, in my experience, rarely gets smaller when one runs from it." Clara twisted her fingers tightly. "Miss Marple. I didn't hurt him. I would never." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "I have not accused you of anything." Clara swallowed, eyes darting. "Everyone will think I had reason to. Uncle Lionel, he was furious with me a few days ago. He threatened to tell my aunt something that would have caused terrible trouble for my mother." Miss Marple raised her brows, concerned. "That must have been very frightening." "It was," Clara whispered. "But I didn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded. "Then you mustn't behave as though you had." Before Clara could answer, footsteps sounded behind them, Inspector Grange. "I'll need you both back in the drawing room," he said, though his eyes lingered on Clara with a hint of suspicion he wasn't bothering to conceal. Clara shivered and walked ahead of them. Miss Marple followed, reflecting quietly. Clara was frightened, yes, but her fear felt less like guilt and more like a young woman caught in an adult's quarrel. Still, Lionel Hargreaves had clearly held something over her. And secrets, Miss Marple knew, were as dangerous as poisons, sometimes more. When they returned, Grange cleared his throat. "I have initial findings. It appears Mr. Hargreaves consumed something shortly before his collapse that acted swiftly. Likely from one of the cups or plates used during the tea. Until we confirm further, everything remains evidence." A nervous murmur rippled across the group. Miss Marple's gaze traveled over the tea things, neat rows of china now tinged with impending dread. She observed which cups the guests looked at, and which they pointedly avoided. She noted Lydia Hargreaves's rigid posture, Mrs. Forsyth's trembling, Colonel Archer's stern glower, Reverend Caddington's worried glances, and Clara's fidgeting hands. People gave themselves away with the smallest gestures. And as Miss Marple stood quietly near the mantelpiece once more, she felt the first crucial piece beginning to form, not a clue, not yet, but a pattern. A pattern of behavior. Every mystery, she knew, began not with evidence, but with people. And the people of Little Bristow were already revealing far more than they realized. Chapter 4, First Suspects. As Inspector Grange moved through his preliminary statements, the atmosphere in the drawing room thickened with a blend of fear and nervous anticipation. The sun outside had shifted, casting longer shadows across the polished wooden floor, as though the light itself hesitated to linger too brightly on a room full of tension. Miss Marple remained quietly observant, her hands resting atop her knitting bag. She did not speak unless spoken to, which often made people underestimate just how much she absorbed. Several guests kept a cautious distance from her, as though she might see more than they wished revealed. It wasn't long before Inspector Grange cleared his throat and addressed the group directly, his expression stern. At this stage, he began, I must focus on those who had close contact with Mr. Hargreaves immediately before his collapse. A few names stand out for further questioning. A ripple of unease traveled across the room. Mrs. Forsyth pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Inspector, surely you can't mean, I'm afraid I must deal with what the facts suggest, Grange said. And for the moment, Mrs. Forsyth, one fact is very plain, several guests witnessed your niece serving Mr. Hargreaves moments before he left for the library. Clara Burrows stiffened as every eye swung toward her. I was just pouring tea, she stammered. For half the room. But Mr. Hargreaves specifically asked you to refill his cup, did he not? Grange pressed. Clara opened and closed her mouth, floundering. He said he preferred the Darjeeling. I poured it, yes. But I didn't do anything to it. Mrs. Forsyth rushed to her niece's defense. Clara is the gentlest girl alive. Inspector, this is preposterous. Miss Marple observed Clara's trembling hands. Fear, yes, but there was something else beneath it. A burden. A secret she had hoped would never surface, now threatening to burst forth under all those accusing eyes. Grange continued without malice but with firm resolve. You also had a disagreement with him earlier this week, Miss Burrows. Clara's face drained of all color. Who told you that? Mrs. Archer shifted uncomfortably. Colonel Archer's gaze avoided Clara's entirely. I make it my job to find things out, Grange said. Clara swallowed hard. It wasn't a fight. Hargreaves confronted me, about something he found out regarding my mother. But I didn't hurt him, Inspector, I swear it. Grange nodded slowly. You'll have the chance to provide a full statement. For now, you remain a person of interest. Clara slumped slightly, as though struck. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. Inspector, if I may, Miss Burrows appears overwhelmed because she is young and unused to suspicion, not because she is guilty of wrongdoing. Grange regarded her with a frown. You may be right, Miss Marple. But I can't ignore the facts. Of course not, she replied calmly. But one must be cautious with obvious suspects. They are so frequently convenient rather than correct. A murmur swept through the room. Inspector Grange straightened. Convenient or not, she isn't the only one with motive. He turned toward Lydia Hargreaves. Mrs. Hargreaves lifted her chin subtly, though her eyes betrayed the slightest twitch of alarm. You and your husband had financial disagreements, Grange said plainly. There were witnesses to more than one argument this month. Lydia's jaw tightened. Many married couples quarrel over money. It does not mean I killed him. Perhaps not, the inspector said, but if Mr. Hargreaves controlled the finances, and you stood to benefit from, I stood to benefit from nothing. Lydia snapped, her composure cracking. Everything was in Lionel's name. Everything. If anything had happened to him, well, here we are, I'm left with debts, not fortunes. That silenced even Colonel Archer. Miss Marple studied Lydia. Her anger was real. But anger was often worn over something else, fear, resentment, or even heartbreak. Lydia's manner held sorrow, yes, but mixed with a strange sort of resignation. Grange wasn't finished. Colonel Archer, he said, turning to the retired officer, several villagers claim you and Mr. Hargreaves quarreled about the sale of a military compass in his shop. The colonel harumphed. Quarrel? It was a disagreement between gentlemen. Lionel bought the blasted thing from me at half its worth, then tried to sell it as if it belonged to some famous general. I told him he was making a mockery of historical artifacts. Mrs. Archer gave a weary sigh, as though the entire matter had exhausted her long before this moment. Miss Marple took silent note of the Colonel's righteous indignation. Pride could be a powerful motivator. Grange flipped a page in his notebook. And Dr. Penrose, the doctor raised both hands. Inspector, surely you don't believe not at all, Grange said evenly. But as a physician, you had unique knowledge of substances that could produce a rapid effect. Dr. Penrose's voice dropped. That does not mean I carry poisons about like sweeties. A few nervous chuckles rippled, quickly stifled. With respect, Miss Marple said gently, many people have motives, Inspector. Financial strain, resentment, secrets, one must first understand the relationships among them. Grange sighed. Relationships, yes. And this village seems full of complicated ones. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Human nature always is. At that moment, a sharp clatter sounded, startling everyone. A teacup had fallen from a small side table near the window. Clara Burrows stood beside it, her hands covering her mouth. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to. No one believed she cared about the cup. They understood what had made her jump. Tension was tightening around her like a noose. Miss Marple moved toward Clara with a steadying presence. My dear, you must not let fear guide you. It leads to the wrong conclusions. For the inspector, and for yourself. Clara nodded shakily, her breath uneven. But Miss Marple saw it. Someone in the room was watching Clara too closely. Someone who wanted her to panic. Someone who stood to benefit from her becoming the obvious suspect. And Miss Marple, who knew far too well the disguises of guilt, felt the faintest stir of suspicion coiling itself, not around the frightened girl before her, but around one of the calm faces watching quietly from across the room. Someone who looked just a little too composed. Chapter 5. A hidden thread. Inspector Grange's questioning concluded only when the late afternoon light had dulled into a muted amber, stretching long across the Hargreaves' sitting room. The cluster of villagers dispersed with visible relief, some eager to leave the oppressive atmosphere, others lingering just long enough to murmur their own interpretations of the inspector's suspicions. Miss Marple, however, did not hurry. She lingered near the window, her delicate fingers resting on the lace curtain as she observed the guests departing. Each person walked with a different rhythm, some stiff with apprehension, others eager to escape scrutiny. But one figure drew her quiet attention, Mrs. Archer. The Colonel's wife had always been a woman of careful composure, her posture straight, her mouth tight with a lifetime's worth of unsaid remarks. Yet today, as she guided her husband toward the gate, she looked distinctly strained. A hand rested on the Colonel's arm, steadying him, or steadying herself. Miss Marple tucked that away. Clara Burrows lingered behind, pale as a sheet as she fidgeted with her gloves. When Lydia Hargreaves finally drifted toward her like a ghost still bound to her own hearth, the two exchanged a glance that was not hostile, but deeply, achingly complicated. Miss Marple? A soft voice pulled her attention. Penrose stood near the mantel, rubbing the bridge of his nose. You appear troubled. Oh, not troubled, she said mildly. Merely thoughtful. He nodded but did not press her, though his eyes seemed to study her with a quiet curiosity. When the room had nearly emptied, Miss Marple approached Inspector Grange, who sat reviewing his notes with furrowed concentration. Inspector, she said, I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment? Grange looked up, his expression softening slightly. Of course, Miss Marple. Though I suspect you're about to tell me something I've overlooked. Not overlooked, she corrected gently. Merely, misinterpreted. Grange sighed as though he had expected exactly this. Go on. Miss Marple lowered her voice. Clara Burrow's reaction. I believe you saw guilt. I saw fear. There is a difference, you know. Fear because she's innocent. Fear because she knows something she has not yet had the courage to share. Grange leaned back. You believe she's hiding details? Oh yes. But not, I think, the sort that condemn her. He tapped his pencil thoughtfully. Then who is guilty, in your estimation? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, it's far too early to say. But I did notice something peculiar during the interviews. Grange waited. Whenever Miss Burrows was questioned, someone else in this room was watching her very keenly. Not with concern, but with calculation. Who? Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with caution. It would be premature to say. Observations must be tested, not assumed. The inspector muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like frustration, but Miss Marple pretended not to hear. Just then, a soft sob drew their attention. Lydia Hargreaves had sunk into one of the armchairs, her face hidden in her hands. Her shoulders trembled, not with theatrical grief, but with a quiet, exhausted despair. Miss Marple approached her with a slow, grandmotherly grace. My dear, you have had a terrible shock. Would you like a glass of water? Lydia looked up with reddened eyes. Miss Marple. I fear you may think ill of me. About the quarrels. About Lionel. Her voice cracked. We had our differences, our struggles, but I never wished him harm. I do not think ill of you, Miss Marple said gently. Not at all. Lydia swallowed, her gaze flickering toward the library door, the place where Lionel had fallen. He was not an easy man. But he didn't deserve this. No one deserves such an end, Miss Marple replied. But when tempers run high in such a small, enclosed place as a village, resentments can gather like dust in corners. Lydia nodded. Everyone here knew Lionel had enemies. Perhaps more than he realized. Miss Marple leaned forward just a fraction. Is there someone in particular you worry about? Lydia hesitated. Her fingers twisted nervously around her handkerchief. I shouldn't say, but yes. Someone did threaten him. Just a week ago. Miss Marple's breath caught, only slightly, so gently no one noticed. Who, my dear? But Lydia froze. Her eyes drifted toward the open doorway where Colonel Archer had stood earlier. She caught herself, looked away quickly, and then shook her head. I can't, she whispered. Not yet. Before Miss Marple could encourage her further, Mrs. Forsyth swept in, fussing over Clara and urging Lydia to rest. The moment shattered like thin glass. Miss Marple stepped back, allowing them space, but she had seen enough. A threat. A quarrel. Someone watching Clara too closely. A pattern was beginning to form, if only faintly, like the first outline of a tapestry. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the tea table one last time. There, beside the pot and cups, sat an overlooked object, a single teaspoon, slightly out of place, its polished surface catching the last glint of daylight. Not obvious. Not dramatic. But wrong. Very wrong. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken just a little. Sometimes murder hid not in bold actions, but in the tiniest, most innocent-looking things. A teaspoon was a small detail. But in Street Mildred's, small details often held the loudest truths. Chapter 6, Secrets Beneath the Surface. Miss Marple stepped out into the cool evening air, the soft rustle of the rose bushes greeting her as she made her way down the gravel path. The last of the departing guests could still be seen along the lane, Mrs. Forsyth shepherding Clara like a protective hen, Colonel Archer marching stiffly ahead of his wife, and Dr. Penrose retreating toward the village with unusually quick steps. The world outside felt deceptively peaceful. A gentle breeze, the scent of damp earth after a long day, and the faint glow of lamps flickering to life in cottage windows. Yet beneath that calm, the threads of tension tugged tighter. Miss Marple had not forgotten the teaspoon. Nor Lydia's whisper of a threat. Nor Clara's trembling fear. And, perhaps most tellingly, the way Mrs. Archer had clutched her husband's arm, as if she feared what he might say, or feared what he might have already done. The inspector joined her on the steps. "You're leaving for the evening?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "One learns to think better after a bit of fresh air and a cup of warm milk." "Is it thinking you'll be doing," Grange asked dryly, "or solving?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, Inspector, I merely notice little things. And little things can be very revealing." Before he could probe further, a sharp cry broke the stillness. "Miss Marple!" Clara Burrows hurried toward her, breathless, cheeks flushed, eyes darting nervously over her shoulder. Mrs. Forsyth followed a few paces behind, unable to keep up with her niece's urgency. "Clara, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, steadying the girl by the arm. "What's happened?" Clara swallowed hard. "Miss Marple, please, may I speak with you? Privately?" Mrs. Forsyth reached them, puffing with disapproval. "Clara, really. This is all making a dreadful spectacle," but Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the older lady's arm. "Mrs. Forsyth, perhaps your niece only wishes to clear her conscience. A small walk up the lane might do her nerves some good." Mrs. Forsyth opened her mouth to object, then paused, reassured by Miss Marple's calm manner. "Well, if you think it best." Clara nodded gratefully and followed Miss Marple a short distance from the house. They walked beneath the arching boughs of a hawthorn tree, the shadows deepening around them. Clara's composure dissolved the moment they were alone. "I didn't do anything to him, Miss Marple," she whispered hoarsely. "But if I don't tell someone what really happened this morning, they'll think I had reason to." Miss Marple gave a small, encouraging nod. "Tell me what troubles you, my dear." Clara took a shaky breath. "Before the party, before everyone arrived, Mr. Hargreaves called me into the library. He said he had information about my mother who passed away last year." Her voice trembled. "He said he knew something I didn't." "And did he tell you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clara shook her head. "No. He said he wanted something in return." A cold shiver threaded down Miss Marple's spine, though her face remained perfectly serene. "He made you a bargain?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "If I convinced Mrs. Forsyth to sell him her silver heirlooms at a low price, far lower than they were worth, he would tell me the truth. If I refused, he'd reveal something about my mother that would shatter to me." The girl's voice broke on the last word. Miss Marple felt a wave of sympathy. "Did you agree?" Clara covered her face with her hands. "I said no. I couldn't do that to Aunt Margaret. She's been so good to me." "And Lionel Hargreaves was furious?" Miss Marple prompted softly. "Yes. He told me I would regret it. And I did regret it, because now it sounds like a motive." A tear slid down Clara's cheek. "But I didn't poison him. I didn't even touch his tea after that. I only poured it." Miss Marple reached into her coat pocket and offered Clara a folded handkerchief. The girl accepted it with trembling fingers. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "you did the right thing in refusing him. And the right thing again in telling the truth now." Clara swallowed. "Do you believe me?" "I do," Miss Marple replied without hesitation. Clara's breath hitched with relief. "But tell me," Miss Marple continued gently, "was anyone else aware of the conversation between you and Mr. Hargreaves? Clara hesitated. I'm not sure. I thought we were alone. But when I left the library, I saw someone in the hallway. Someone who looked startled. Who? Miss Marple asked, her tone as calm as a still pond. Clara looked up, fear flickering in her eyes. Mrs. Archer. Miss Marple's heartbeat skipped, not with surprise but with confirmation. She placed a steadying hand on Clara's arm. You've been very brave, she said. And you've told me something very important. Before Clara could respond, a distant shout echoed across the lane. It was Colonel Archer's voice, sharp, commanding, and unmistakably alarmed. Clara froze. Miss Marple turned, her senses sharpening like a drawn needle. Something new had occurred. Something that would shift the investigation once more. And Miss Marple, who understood better than most that murder rarely walked alone, quickened her steps toward the source of the commotion. Chapter 7. A sudden turn. Miss Marple hurried toward the lane, Clara close behind her, though the girl's frightened steps faltered with each echo of Colonel Archer's shouts. The calm evening had cracked like thin ice, the peaceful village momentarily transformed into a landscape of shadows and alarm. As they rounded the bend near the Archers' stone-walled garden, they found Colonel Archer standing rigidly beside his iron gate, his face flushed and his breath sharp with agitation. "Colonel?" Miss Marple asked gently. "What has happened?" He pointed a trembling finger toward the small patch of gravel beside his gate. "Footprints, fresh ones. Someone's been lurking about the property. No decent person skulks around another man's house at this hour." Miss Marple lowered her gaze, studying the impressions. They were indeed recent, shallow yet defined, as though someone had moved quickly, lightly. The toes pointed toward the Archers' back garden, toward the very direction of their conservatory door. Clara whimpered softly. Mrs. Archer emerged from the house moments later, her face even paler than Clara's, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. "Henry, please," she said breathlessly, "you're frightening everyone." "I have every right to be frightened," the colonel barked. "Lionel Hargreaves is dead, and now someone's skulking around my house. It's no coincidence." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did you see who it was, Colonel?" "No," he snapped. "But whoever it was left in a hurry. Nearly knocked the blasted watering can over." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the overturned watering can lying on its side near the edge of the garden path. Water trickled across the gravel, glistening faintly in the dimming light. She walked closer and crouched delicately. Her joints, she was fond of saying, had never troubled her as much as they ought to at her age. She examined the footprints again. Light. Narrow. Not a man's boot. Not even Colonel Archer's sturdy household staff. A woman's shoe, perhaps. Or a very slight young man's. She rose slowly. "Inspector Grange must be notified. He'll want to see these prints before the dew settles." Colonel Archer grumbled, though his bluster had softened somewhat now that Miss Marple had taken command of the situation with calm authority. Clara stepped closer. "Miss Marple, do you think whoever it was heard something? Or saw something?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the Archers in turn, first the colonel, then his wife. Mrs. Archer seemed frozen in place, her gaze fixed not on the footprints, but on the overturned watering can, as though the sight of it unsettled her more deeply than the unknown trespasser. "Mrs. Archer," Miss Marple said softly, "were you at home the entire afternoon?" The woman's lips trembled. Yes, of course. Henry and I returned immediately after the questioning." "Why do you ask?" "The footprints," Miss Marple replied gently, "came from the direction of your conservatory door, not the lane. It suggests someone may have emerged from your garden, not entered it." Colonel Archer stiffened. "Nonsense. No one was in our garden. Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. Colonel, you are a soldier. You stand firmly on what you believe. But sometimes, when emotions are running high, one might overlook the quieter signs. Mrs. Archer's gaze darted away. Colonel Archer's brow furrowed. Are you implying someone was hiding in our garden earlier today? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. I am only observing what the footprints suggest. At that moment, a distant light flickered at the far end of the lane, Inspector Grange approaching in haste, his silhouette outlined by the warm glow of his lantern. He reached them, his breath quick but controlled. Colonel Archer sent word. What's happened now? Miss Marple guided him toward the footprints. Grange crouched beside them. You're right, they're fresh. And small. Someone was standing very near that window. He turned suddenly to Mrs. Archer. Did you hear anything unusual inside the house? She shook her head, too quickly. No. Nothing at all. Miss Marple watched the woman with quiet, penetrating sympathy. Grange straightened. Colonel, I'll need to search your garden. Search all you like, the colonel barked. If someone is spying on us, I want to know. As the inspector and Colonel Archer marched toward the conservatory, lantern swinging, Miss Marple stepped aside with Clara, her expression thoughtful. What do you think it means? Clara whispered. My dear, Miss Marple said softly, people hide for all sorts of reasons. But rarely without purpose. Clara's hands tightened around Miss Marple's sleeve. Do you think it was the murderer? Miss Marple's voice was serene. Possibly. Or someone frightened of what they know. Behind them, Mrs. Archer let out a small, choked sound, one she quickly disguised as a cough. Miss Marple caught the sound, filed it away, and continued gently, truth has a habit of pressing forward, even when people try terribly hard to bury it. Clara swallowed hard. And when it comes out? Miss Marple's gaze followed the inspector's lantern beam across the Archer's darkened garden. When it comes out, she said quietly, it changes everything. Just then, Inspector Grange called sharply from the conservatory. Miss Marple. You might want to see this. She moved toward him with steady, deliberate steps. For there, hidden beneath the Archer's garden bench, something glinted faintly in the inspector's lantern light. Something metallic. Something very much out of place. And Miss Marple, even before she reached it, felt a cold certainty settle over her. This discovery would shift the entire investigation, and reveal the first true crack in someone's story. Chapter 8, The Object Beneath the Bench. Miss Marple approached the conservatory with steady steps, her eyes adjusting to the shifting lantern light as Inspector Grange crouched near the garden bench. The colonel hovered behind him, bristling with indignation, while Mrs. Archer stood a little farther away, her gloved hands clasped so tightly the knuckles blanched. Over here, Grange said, his voice tinged with a mix of triumph and unease. He lifted the lantern slightly. Look. Nestled in the damp soil beneath the bench lay a slender metal case, no larger than a gentleman's spectacles case, its surface smudged but unmistakably expensive. Miss Marple recognized at once the fine monogram engraved into the lid, L. Lionel Hargreaves. Oh dear, Miss Marple murmured, though her tone carried no surprise. That should not be here. The colonel leaned forward, squinting. What on earth? That's Hargreaves' property. I've seen him carry that case for years. Always kept it in his breast pocket. Inspector Grange lifted the case, careful not to smudge the inscription further. And yet here it is, buried in your garden. Mrs. Archer made a small sound, a gasp, quickly suppressed, but Grange caught it. His gaze shifted toward her, sharp and questioning. Mrs. Archer, he said, have you seen this item before? She drew in a trembling breath. And no. Never. But her voice wavered, betraying a truth she desperately wished to conceal. Clara, standing behind Miss Marple, whispered, "Why would Mr. Hargreaves' case be here?" Miss Marple answered softly, "Because someone wanted it hidden." The inspector snapped open the case. Inside were several folded papers and 2 small vials secured in velvet lining. One vial was still sealed. The other, only half full. A hush fell around them. Penrose, who had joined them moments earlier after hearing the commotion, leaned forward. "Those vials, may I look?" Inspector Grange hesitated, then held the open case toward him. "Carefully, Doctor." Penrose examined the half-empty vial with clinical precision. Whatever it contained, it was not a household substance. "This is laboratory-grade glass, the sort used for controlled compounds." "Poison?" Grange asked. Penrose didn't answer immediately. "Possibly. But I would need to test it. And until then, I cannot say which kind, or how it was used." Colonel Archer huffed. "Are you suggesting the murderer left this on my property?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unequivocal. "Someone left it here, Colonel. That is the important point." Inspector Grange snapped the case shut. "Colonel, Mrs. Archer, I will need to search your home more thoroughly." Mrs. Archer blanched. "Search our? But why?" "Because," Grange replied, "if someone was hiding in your garden, they may have entered the house as well. And because this," he tapped the case, "links your property to the victim." Colonel Archer sputtered with indignation, but Miss Marple watched Mrs. Archer instead. The woman's lips quivered, though she tried to maintain a veneer of composure. "Fear, yes. But also something deeper. Guilt? Or dread of a different truth emerging?" Miss Marple turned her attention to the folded papers inside the case, which Grange had tucked safely into his pocket. "Inspector," she said softly, "may I ask, what type of papers were those?" Grange paused. "I haven't opened them fully yet. But from what I glimpsed," he frowned. "Handwritten notes. Several pages. Possibly letters." Miss Marple's brows knitted. "Letters can be quite revealing. Many people write what they cannot say aloud." The colonel bristled. "This is ridiculous. We had no visitors in the garden. And why would these incriminating things be left under our bench?" Miss Marple glanced at him politely. "Oh, Colonel, people in distress seldom hide things with logic. They hide them with haste." Clara shivered. "Miss Marple, does this mean the murderer was here? In the Archer's garden?" The older woman looked at her with quiet gravity. "It suggests that someone who handled Mr. Hargreaves' belongings came here soon after his death. Possibly before the inspector arrived on the scene." "And why would they do that?" Grange murmured. Miss Marple lowered her gaze to the footprints leading from the garden to the lane. "To hide something they could not afford to have found." Mrs. Archer suddenly spoke, her voice thin, strained. "Inspector Grange, you must believe me. Henry and I had nothing to do with any of this. Our quarrel with Lionel was trivial. Everyone in the village knows my husband dislikes how Lionel ran his shop. That is all." Miss Marple studied her gently. "My dear, it is very difficult to judge the true weight of quarrels. Sometimes those that seem small to outsiders feel quite enormous to those involved." Mrs. Archer swallowed, unable to meet her eyes. A silence settled, heavy, uncertain. At last, Inspector Grange straightened decisively. "I need to examine the contents of this case. And I want those letters sorted before nightfall." He turned to Miss Marple. "Will you walk back with me? I'd appreciate your perspective." Miss Marple nodded. Of course, Inspector. As they began down the lane, lantern light bobbing ahead of them, Clara lingered behind, glancing nervously at the Archers. Mrs. Archer watched the group leave with eyes full of dread, as though the discovery of that case had brought her closer to a truth she had long feared would surface. Miss Marple, glancing back at her, saw the unmistakable signs. Not shock. Not guilt. But recognition. And recognition, in Miss Marple's long experience, was far more dangerous. For it meant Mrs. Archer knew exactly what was hidden in that case. And more importantly, who had put it there. Chapter 9, Shadows in the Parlor. As Miss Marple and Inspector Grange stepped into the Archers' parlor, the warmth of the fire did little to dispel the tension that clung to the air like damp fog. The inspector placed the recovered case on the small writing desk near the window, its metal surface catching the faint glow of the hearth. Clara followed a step behind Miss Marple, her face still pale from the discovery in the garden. We'll start with the papers, Grange said, pulling up a chair. If there's anything that clarifies why Hargreaves was carrying these, we need to know now. Miss Marple nodded, settling herself calmly into an armchair. Best we begin with whatever is on top. People often place the most urgent thing where they can reach it first. Grange opened the case and drew out the folded pages. The first was a letter, its edges worn, as though handled repeatedly. He unfolded it carefully. The ink was dark, the handwriting precise. Clara leaned forward. Is it from Mr. Hargreaves? The inspector scanned the opening lines, then frowned. No, it's addressed to him. He cleared his throat and read aloud, Lionel, you must stop pressing the matter. I cannot bear the consequences if this continues. There are things that were never meant to be brought into the light. End this before someone gets hurt. There was no signature. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Clara whispered, it sounds like a warning. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. Or a plea. Someone was desperate to prevent Mr. Hargreaves from pursuing something. Inspector Grange set the letter aside and opened the next page, another note, this one more hastily written, the lines uneven. If you insist on going to her, do it quietly. She must not suspect you know. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Her. That narrows the field considerably. Clara hesitated. Mrs. Archer looked terrified when she saw the case. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, but terror can have many sources. Guilt is only one of them. The inspector leaned back. So Hargreaves was threatening to expose something involving a woman. And someone was warning him off. He turned to Miss Marple. Any thoughts about who this her might be? Miss Marple considered. There are only so many women in the village with a connection to Mr. Hargreaves strong enough to prompt a secret warning. Mrs. Archer is one. Mrs. Penrose perhaps. And, she paused. Miss Whitfield. Clara blinked. Miss Whitfield? But she adored Mr. Hargreaves. Everyone said, yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Everyone said so. Sometimes affection binds people closer to danger than dislike ever could. Grange pursed his lips. We'll question her again. Before he could reach for the next letter, a soft knock sounded at the parlor door. The colonel stepped in, his expression tight. Inspector, he said stiffly, if you're quite finished turning our home into a police station, but he stopped short when his eyes landed on the open case. That again, he muttered. It has nothing to do with us. Miss Marple looked up calmly. Colonel, did you know Mr. Hargreaves' spectacles case contained letters? Letters? He blinked, genuinely taken aback. No. I only ever saw him keep his glasses and his cleaning cloth in it. Nothing more. Inspector Grange narrowed his gaze. You're certain? Of course I'm certain. His voice wavered. Lionel wouldn't have shown me his personal things. Miss Marple watched him closely, the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, the way his eyes avoided the papers spread out across the desk. Colonel, she said gently, when did you last see Mr. Hargreaves before the tea, exactly? His jaw tightened. This morning. Briefly. That is not what your wife said earlier, Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but firm. The colonel froze. Clara inhaled sharply. Inspector Grange leaned forward. Colonel Archer, what were you arguing with Hargreaves about today? The colonel's face reddened. It was nothing. A misunderstanding. Most misunderstandings, Miss Marple said softly, come from truths people wish to hide. The colonel swallowed hard. His shoulders sagged, not in guilt, but in resignation. It wasn't about me, he said at last, voice low. It was about my wife. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Inspector Grange's eyes narrowed further. Go on. The colonel cleared his throat. Lionel came to see me. He said someone had been sending him anonymous letters about my wife. He thought I should know. Miss Marple tilted her head. Anonymous letters can be quite malicious things. What did they accuse her of? Colonel Archer hesitated, then spoke with difficulty. They said she had been meeting someone in secret. That she had debts. That she was desperate. Clara whispered, debts? Miss Marple remained calm. Did you believe it, Colonel? No. Of course not, he said quickly, though doubt flickered in his eyes. I confronted Lionel. I told him to stop spreading nonsense. That's all there was to it. Inspector Grange tapped the metal case. Then why hide this under your garden bench? I didn't hide anything. Miss Marple watched the colonel's trembling hands. No, he wasn't lying. But he was afraid. Not for himself. For his wife. Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. Colonel, did your wife know you met with Mr. Hargreaves before the tea? He hesitated. Then, reluctantly, no. And, Miss Marple added softly, does she know about the letters? A shudder passed through him. No. Inspector Grange straightened. Then we will need to speak to her again. At once. The colonel opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, the door swung open. Mrs. Archer stood in the doorway, pale as moonlight. You don't need to question me, she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held a terrible, fragile clarity. Because I already know who hid that case in our garden. Chapter 10, Truth Beneath the Teacups. A tremor passed through the room as Mrs. Archer's words hung in the air. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warm glow at odds with the cold dread that seemed to settle over everyone present. Inspector Grange rose slowly. Mrs. Archer, you know who hid the case? She nodded once, small, precise, as though afraid any larger movement might shatter her resolve. Yes, she whispered. And it wasn't my husband. Nor anyone you've questioned so far. Miss Marple observed her with quiet compassion. Then please, dear, tell us. Mrs. Archer stepped into the room, her hands twisting together. Her elegant composure, always so admired in the village, had cracked, revealing beneath it a woman worn thin by fear and secrets. It was my sister, she said softly. Evelyn. Clara's eyes widened. Miss Whitfield? Mrs. Archer gave a tiny nod. She came by the garden gate after the commotion began. I didn't realize what she'd done until much later. Inspector Grange frowned. Why would Miss Whitfield hide the case? Miss Marple, who had not taken her eyes from Mrs. Archer's face, gently prompted, perhaps, my dear, you might start at the beginning. A shuddering breath escaped her. Evelyn has always been the fragile one. People see her sweetness, her quiet nature, but they do not see how deeply she attaches herself to others, how desperately she fears losing them. Her voice faltered. She adored Lionel. Inspector Grange straightened. But they weren't, no, Mrs. Archer said quickly. Not in any improper way. But she depended on his attention. He was kind to her. Too kind, perhaps. She mistook his politeness for something more. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Unrequited affection can be a dangerous thing. Mrs. Archer nodded. When Lionel discovered the anonymous letters I received about my supposed debts and secret meetings, he became concerned for me. He told Evelyn he wanted to help uncover the sender. Her eyes filled with tears. Evelyn panicked. She thought he would find out that she had written them. Clara gasped. She wrote the letters? Yes, Mrs. Archer whispered. She wanted Lionel to think I was unstable. That I needed care. She believed that would keep him close, that he would worry for us, and spend more time at our home. Her hands trembled violently. When Lionel confronted me before the party, I realized what Evelyn had been doing. I begged him not to tell anyone. I didn't want my sister's reputation destroyed. Inspector Grange's brow furrowed. But how did that lead to murder? Mrs. Archer looked up, anguish etched across her face. Evelyn overheard us. She thought Lionel meant to expose her. When he left the parlor, she followed him to the garden. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, as though confirming something she had suspected. Mrs. Archer continued, voice barely audible. I didn't see the moment itself. But I saw her coming back in. Her hands were shaking, and there was something wild in her eyes. She pressed a hand to her mouth. When the commotion began and Lionel was found, she ran straight to me. She said she only meant to frighten him. That he stumbled. That he fell. Silence swallowed the room. Clara whispered, so she didn't mean to kill him, Mrs. Archer shook her head. I don't know what she meant. But she was terrified. She begged me to protect her. Her voice cracked. So I let her hide the case while I tried to keep everyone inside. Inspector Grange stood rigidly still. Where is Miss Whitfield now? Mrs. Archer closed her eyes. In the kitchen. I told her to stay there. The inspector moved toward the door, but Miss Marple rose gently, extending a hand. Inspector, she said softly, may I speak to her first? She will be frightened, and more likely to tell the truth fully if approached calmly. Grange hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple walked from the parlor with her usual unhurried steps, though Clara could see the weight she carried in them. The kitchen was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Evelyn Whitfield sat at the small table, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes wide and distant, as though trapped in a nightmare she could neither wake from nor understand. When Miss Marple entered, Evelyn flinched. Oh, she whispered. You. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. Yes, my dear. Only me. Evelyn gulped. Is everyone very angry? No, Miss Marple said softly. Only very sad. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. I didn't mean to. I only grabbed his sleeve. I didn't want him to go to the inspector. I knew that if he told them what I'd done, they would despise me. I couldn't bear it. Miss Marple sat opposite her. And when he pulled away. He stumbled. Her voice broke. He fell against the sundial. And then there was blood. So much blood. She pressed trembling fingers to her lips. I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. I ran to Margaret. I always run to her. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand over Evelyn's cold fingers. Yes. Sisters often do. Evelyn sobbed. I didn't mean to kill him. I didn't. I only wanted him to stay. Miss Marple nodded sadly. I know. At that moment, Inspector Grange stepped quietly into the kitchen. Evelyn looked up at him, terrified. He spoke gently. Miss Whitfield, you must come with me. Evelyn bowed her head. Mrs. Archer watched from the doorway, tears streaking her face as her sister was led away. When they were gone, Clara turned to Miss Marple, her voice shaking. How did you know? Miss Marple sighed softly. My dear, people reveal a great deal in the smallest gestures. Miss Whitfield's trembling earlier was not merely shock, it was the trembling of someone who feared discovery, not loss. Mrs. Archer covered her face with her hands. I have failed her. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. No, my dear. You protected her as long as you could. But sometimes, the truth must be allowed its freedom. In the days that followed, St. Aldwyn returned slowly, cautiously, to its familiar rhythms. There were whispers, of course, villagers at the bakery or post office murmuring sorrowfully about Miss Whitfield's fragile mind, about Mrs. Archer's heartbreak, about the tragedy that had tainted what should have been a pleasant afternoon tea. But the village also showed kindness. Flowers left quietly at the Archer's gate. Notes of sympathy slipped under the door. A gentler gossip than usual, softened by compassion. One crisp morning, Clara visited Miss Marple in her cozy sitting room. The old armchair creaked as Miss Marple rocked slightly, knitting needles clicking with calm precision. Miss Marple, Clara said softly, was there ever a chance that things might have turned out differently? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, Clara dear, human nature is a complicated thing. Jealousy, longing, fear, they grow quietly in the corners of one's heart. Unless tended with honesty, they can overwhelm even the gentlest of souls. Clara nodded, absorbing the words. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. But remember this. Even in tragedy, there is the possibility of understanding. And in understanding, perhaps a little healing. Clara smiled, touched by the older woman's wisdom. They sat for a while in companionable silence, the sunlight drifting through the lace curtains. Outside, the village went on with its quiet life, children laughing near the green, a baker sliding fresh loaves into his window, neighbors greeting one another with soft words and sympathetic smiles. The peace returned, delicate but real. And Miss Marple, with her serene expression and gentle hands, continued her knitting, content, for the moment, that she had once again untangled the threads of human nature and revealed the truth beneath them.